Okay, excuse me, welcome back. This is a nice short lecture. I'm going to talk about 5 parts to computation. All programming languages, I don't care what they are, have to satisfy these 5 things in some form or another. It's a good thing to remember because when you're learning a new language, basically if you learn these 5 things in this order, it helps structure the way you approach learning these things. You're not just kind of flailing around. You can do this in a very organized way. So these are things to look for, and these are things that we're going to talk about as we go through the camp. So what are we learning? The 5 parts of programming that all programming languages must perform. And here they are. The first thing, every programming language must have a way to introduce attributes and variables in the program. We usually call that declaration. You're declaring to the program, hey, I'm going to use this variable now. So it's a declaration that you intend to use a particular variable. Different programming languages do this differently. We'll talk specifically, of course, about how Java does it, but if you're aware that that has to happen and you're learning a new programming language, then you know to look for that. Once variables are introduced into a program, the next thing is we have to have the ability to assign values to them. So that's the big 2, introducing variables and then assigning values. The next 2, select and repeat, has to do with allowing the software to change its behavior based on specific conditions. So selection, you have to be able to select pieces of code that execute or don't execute. And this is universally or virtually universally done with something called an if-then-else structure. If this is true, then do this, otherwise else do that. So this allows you to basically turn on and off pieces of code based on the specific conditions at the time, which means that your code can respond to user input, can respond to unique data sets. If you didn't have a code that was responding to user input, it wouldn't be any good, right? If you played a game that no matter what you did, it did the same thing all the time, you wouldn't play that game. So selection is allowing the code to respond to the user. You also need to be able to repeat sections of code, and this is done using for loops and while loops and other forms of iteration. This is done and necessary because when you have data sets of varying size, you need to be able to, say, do the same piece of action on the first piece of data, the second piece of data, the third piece of data. So rather than having to write repeated sections of code for all that data, you basically have one piece of code that gets repeated. Do this piece of code for this data item, now do it for the next data item, next do it for the next data item. So those are the 4 basic things for computation: declaring the variables, assigning values to variables, selecting what part of your code you want to execute or not using if-then-else structures, repeating sections of code, usually using for loops and while loops. And then lastly, you have to have some kind of input and output. If you didn't have input, then the user could not control the program. If you didn't have output, where the results of the program were shown to the user, then all that computation would happen, but nobody would care because you'd never see it. So these are the 5 things, and this kind of frames how we're going to approach learning Java. We're going to learn these roughly in this order, starting with declaration and assignment, and then go on to selection, then repetition. We're going to kind of fold input-output in there along the way. So be aware, that's what we're looking for.